The stories that came out of the rock and roll era were like nothing the world had ever seen before. These weren't just musicians, they were forces of nature who performed night after night in a state that most people couldn't imagine walking across a room in. Here are 12 rock stars from the 60s and 70s who were always high on stage. Number 12, Keith Richards. There is probably no figure in rock history more associated with substances and survival than Keith Richards. Through the 1960s and deep into the 1970s, Richards performed hundreds of Rolling Stones concerts while carrying habits that would have floored anyone else. His drug use during this era was not occasional, it was a constant, and the band's roadies and management simply worked around it. What made Richards remarkable was that his playing didn't deteriorate. If anything, there was a looseness to his guitar work on nights when he was most chemically altered, a kind of slow-burning swagger that became the backbone of songs like Honky Tonk Women and Brown Sugar. People who worked closely with the Stones during the 1970s tours described Richards as functioning on a completely different schedule from everyone else. He would sometimes arrive at soundcheck in the late afternoon after being awake through the previous night, conduct himself with a strange calm, and then walk out and perform as though none of it had happened. His dependency on heroin through much of the 1970s was described by band associates as severe. The logistics of keeping him supplied and functional on the road became part of the operation. There are accounts from crew members of those years who describe elaborate systems put in place simply to ensure Richards made it to the stage. Mick Jagger, by contrast, was disciplined and health-conscious even during those years. The contrast between the two frontmen was striking to everyone around them. His arrest in Toronto in February 1977, where Canadian authorities charged him with possession of heroin with intent to traffic, put his future in serious jeopardy. He faced the very real possibility of years in a Canadian prison. He avoided that outcome through legal representation and ultimately received a suspended sentence, partly on the condition that he perform a benefit concert for the blind. The incident confirmed what had been an open secret for years. Richards himself has spoken about this period with his usual dry candor, neither glorifying it nor fully apologizing for it. He simply describes it as the way he was living at the time. Number 11, Syd Barrett.
She's often inclined to borrow somebody's dreams till...
Syd Barrett was the original creative force behind Pink Floyd, the songwriter, the visionary, and the frontman who launched the band into the British psychedelic scene in the mid-1960s. The early Pink Floyd shows in London's underground clubs were built on his ideas, his imagery, and his guitar work. By the time the band began gaining serious commercial traction, Barrett's use of LSD had become extraordinarily heavy, even by the standards of that era. Eyewitness accounts from fellow band members and concert-goers describe Barrett standing on stage in a near catatonic state during some performances, sometimes not playing his guitar at all, sometimes running his slide up and down the strings without making recognizable music, sometimes staring into the stage lights without any apparent awareness of where he was. Roger Waters, Nick Mason, and Richard Wright have all described the distress of watching him deteriorate in real time while still trying to hold shows together around him. At other performances, Barrett was sharp, charismatic, and brilliant, exactly the artist they had signed on to play alongside. The difference from night to night was completely unpredictable. There was no knowing which Syd was going to arrive at the venue. Roadies would try to assess his condition before a show, and the band would calibrate their expectations accordingly. Sometimes, those assessments were wildly off. By 1968, his bandmates had quietly begun rehearsing with David Gilmour as his replacement, sometimes bringing both guitarists to gigs with the unspoken plan that Barrett might not be able to go on. The transition away from him was handled gently and with genuine sadness. Barrett eventually retreated from public life almost entirely, living with his mother in Cambridge in the years that followed and occasionally appearing in ways that made clear his mind had been permanently altered. He died in 2006. His story is one of the most genuinely tragic in rock history, a gifted mind overtaken by the tools of the era long before his time. Number 10, Janis Joplin. Janis Joplin hit the stage at the Monterey Pop Festival in June 1967 and left the crowd stunned. Her voice was raw and powerful in a way that seemed almost physically impossible. A blues howl coming out of a young white woman from Port Arthur, Texas, that nobody in that audience had heard anything like before. Backstage and before shows, she was frequently fueling that energy with Southern Comfort whiskey and, increasingly, as the years went on, heroin. Joplin was open about her use in a way that was unusual even for that period. She talked about it in interviews with a frankness that made reporters uncomfortable. She referenced it offhandedly in conversations with journalists as though it were simply part of her biography, no more remarkable than growing up in Texas or learning to sing the blues. And she performed in states that ranged from brilliantly loose to visibly impaired, depending on the night and the amount.
Good enough for me and my Bobby, yeah.
People who toured with her in both Big Brother and the Holding Company and later in the Cosmic Blues Band described the same contradiction again and again. The more emotionally raw she was going into a show, the more her performances connected. The substances seemed to lower a wall between her and the audience that other singers kept firmly in place. But they also made her unpredictable in ways that stressed everyone around her. She missed rehearsals, showed up late, sometimes had to be steered toward the stage by handlers. Joplin died on October 4, 1970, from an accidental heroin overdose at the landmark Motor Hotel in Hollywood. She was 27 years old. The previous summer, Woodstock in August 1969, the full force of her live appearances through that year had represented the simultaneous peak of her power and the depth of her habit. She had been trying to clean up in the weeks before her death, which made the overdose all the more painful for those who knew her. Her voice remains one of the most immediately recognizable sounds of that entire era. Number 9. Jim Morrison. Jim Morrison arrived at Doors concerts carrying an entire mythology with him. The leather pants, the poetry, the theatrical presence, the sense that anything might happen. He fed that mythology with alcohol, LSD, and whatever else was available in the years the Doors were active. His drinking was the most consistent element. He was a heavy, daily drinker from his early 20s, and by the time the band was filling arenas in the late 1960s, the effects were impossible to miss on certain nights. There were evenings when Morrison delivered unforgettable performances, the kind of raw, boundary-pushing stage presence that made the Doors genuinely unlike anything else at the time. He could command a crowd with stillness, with silence, with sudden, unpredictable movement. And then there were the other nights, when he was incoherent, when he forgot lyrics mid-song, when he wandered to the edge of the stage and seemed genuinely confused about where he was, when he sat down and simply stopped performing. The band learned to navigate around him, extending instrumental sections when he disappeared into himself.
Come on, baby, light my fire.
His infamous 1969 concert in Miami, where he was subsequently charged with lewd and lascivious behavior, indecent exposure, and public intoxication, marked a turning point. The charges and the wave of concert cancellations that followed from venues now wary of booking the band effectively ended the Doors' touring career in the United States. Morrison was convicted in 1970 and was appealing the verdict when he died in Paris in July 1971. Ray Manzarek, the band's keyboardist and Morrison's closest creative collaborator, spoke about those years many times in the decades that followed. He described both the exhilaration of the good nights, when Morrison was fully present and the performance was electric, and the quiet despair of watching a friend consume himself in real time. They never knew which Morrison was going to walk out under the lights.
Come on, baby, light my fire.
Number 8. Graham Parsons.
I was right beside you.
Graham Parsons is not as widely remembered by mainstream audiences as some of the names on this list, but within the world of country rock, he is foundational. The artist most credited with bridging Nashville's musical traditions and the California counterculture of the late 1960s. He was also, throughout most of his performing years, deeply committed to alcohol and a rotating combination of other substances. His time with the Byrds in 1968, a single album, the landmark Sweetheart of the Rodeo, was marked by conflicts that went beyond his musical vision. Colleagues from that period described trying to keep him functional for recording sessions, let alone shows. When he formed the Flying Burrito Brothers later that year with Chris Hillman, the pattern continued. There were performances where Parsons was genuinely inspired. connecting the threads between country, soul, and rock in ways that nobody else was doing, and performances where the band essentially carried him through. His friendship with Keith Richards, which developed through their shared enthusiasms in the early 1970s, is often cited as an influence on the Stones' own flirtation with country music. It did nothing to moderate Parsons' habits. Emmylou Harris, who sang alongside him in the last years of his career, has spoken about watching him struggle while also being astonished by what he could produce musically, even in diminished states. Parsons died in September 1973 at the Joshua Tree Inn in California from a morphine and alcohol overdose. He was 26 years old. In the years since, artists ranging from the Eagles to Elvis Costello to Ryan Adams have pointed to him as a defining influence. His records hold up. The tragedy is that there were so few of them.
I was right beside you.
Number 7. Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix played guitar in a way that seemed to defy what was physically achievable with the instrument. Left-handed, playing a right-handed guitar strung in reverse, he produced sounds that other guitarists spent years trying to replicate and never quite got there. He was also, throughout his peak years from 1967 to 1970, using a wide range of substances, LSD, amphetamines, barbiturates, and alcohol among them, that his friends, managers, and bandmates tried with limited success to manage. His performances at Monterey in 1967 and Woodstock in August 1969 are the ones most people point to. The Woodstock set in particular, where he closed the festival in the early morning hours and delivered an extended version of The Star-Spangled Banner that became one of the defining moments of that entire generation, came after a night of virtually no sleep and considerable chemical input. What came out of his amplifiers in those 40 minutes was unlike anything that had existed before. But the toll was accumulating. People close to Hendrix described a musician who was genuinely trying to manage his use while being surrounded by an environment that made that almost impossible. Dealers came directly to him. His management situation, long dominated by his original manager Michael Jeffrey, was chaotic and at times exploitative. Hendrix rarely had a clear accounting of his own finances or a stable support structure around him. He expressed to friends in the last year of his life that he wanted to slow down, to study music formally, to work with orchestras and big bands, to build something more expansive and sustainable than the experience model had allowed. He never got the chance. Hendrix died in London in September 1970 at 27 from asphyxiation related to barbiturate intoxication.
Right back one of these days.
Number 6. Jerry Garcia. Jerry Garcia and the Grateful Dead essentially created a touring culture of their own. Extended improvisation, a devoted traveling fan base, and a shared understanding between the musicians and the audience that the music and the substances circulating through the crowd were part of the same experience. Garcia himself moved through various substances across the band's career, with heroin becoming increasingly central through the 1970s. Dead concerts during this decade were famously unpredictable in the best possible sense. Sets would stretch for hours. A song that clocked in at 4 minutes on record might unspool for 20 minutes live, wandering through entirely unexpected territory before finding its way back. Part of that was genuine musical philosophy. Garcia and the band believed deeply in live discovery, in following a musical idea wherever it wanted to go. Part of it was also simply the reality of who Garcia was and what he was absorbing night after night. People who knew the Dead during those years described Garcia as gentle, intellectually curious, and capable of remarkable musical focus even in states of significant impairment. His fingers on the strings seemed to operate on a kind of autopilot that the rest of him could float above. He was also beloved in a way that made intervention almost impossible. The people around him adored him too much to push back with any real force, and the band's freewheeling philosophy did not lend itself to hard rules about behavior. The audience, the Deadheads who followed the band from city to city in a rolling caravan that became its own subculture, accepted the unpredictability as inseparable from the experience. You went to a Dead show not knowing what you would get. That was precisely the point. Number 5. Iggy Pop. Iggy Pop with the Stooges was doing things on stage in the early 1970s that most performers wouldn't attempt sober, diving headfirst into crowds from 6-foot stages, cutting himself with broken glass, smearing himself with raw meat or peanut butter, provoking audiences in Detroit and Ann Arbor who sometimes came ready to fight back. These performances were confrontational, chaotic, and physically dangerous, and they were fueled by a combination of substances that Iggy has discussed openly over the decades since. The Stooges recorded Raw Power in 1973 with David Bowie producing, or attempting to produce, depending on who is telling the story, and toured behind it in a state that their original label, Elektra, had found alarming enough to drop them. The band was difficult to manage and expensive to sustain, not because they were demanding rock stars in the conventional sense, but because the logistics of keeping the frontman functional from night to night had become genuinely complicated. By the mid-1970s, Pop was in seriously deteriorated shape. David Bowie, who had admired him from a distance, helped arrange for them to relocate to Berlin together in 1976. What came out of that period, Iggy's albums The Idiot and Lust for Life, released in 1977, were some of the most creative work of both men's careers, produced in an environment that was at least partially about getting clean. Looking back at footage from those early 70s Stooges shows, the chaos is impossible to miss. So is something genuinely unprecedented, a physical intensity that hadn't existed before in rock, and that every punk band that followed drew from directly. Number 4. Ozzy Osbourne. Ozzy Osbourne spent the 1970s as the lead vocalist of Black Sabbath, one of the heaviest, darkest, and most influential bands of the era, and his habits were fully in keeping with the music. Alcohol was the constant, so were barbiturates and various prescription medications that he combined with whatever was available on the road. His bandmates, Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward, were themselves no strangers to excess, but Osbourne's use was consistently the most visible and the most unpredictable. Sabbath's touring schedule through the 1970s was relentless in the way that only bands of that era endured. Hundreds of shows across multiple years, crossing continents, playing markets from Birmingham to Japan to the United States, with barely enough time between dates to recover physically. Band members have recalled specific instances where Osbourne was barely coherent in the hours before a show, and then walked out in front of a crowd and performed with an energy that caught everyone off guard. The stage itself seemed to reach him in a way that nothing else did. Tony Iommi has spoken in interviews about the difficulty of managing those years, trying to keep the band on schedule and the performances consistent, while their singer operated on a fundamentally different rhythm from everyone else. His departure from Black Sabbath came in 1979, under circumstances that were partly musical and partly a recognition by both sides that his habits had become unmanageable even within a group that had considerable tolerance for excess. The solo career that followed in the 1980s is its own long story, but the Sabbath decade is where the legend was built. Number 3. Grace Slick. Grace Slick was the voice of Jefferson Airplane and one of the most commanding stage presences of the late 1960s. She performed at Woodstock in August 1969, at the disastrous Altamont concert that December, and at hundreds of other shows across that era, while being more forthright about her use of LSD and alcohol than almost any other female performer of the time. She didn't hide it, didn't soften it, and didn't apologize for it. Her performance style was striking in a specific way, cool where other singers were passionate, controlled where others were frantic. She stood tall and sang with absolute conviction, and that composure held even when, by her own account, she was significantly altered. There are concert recordings from the Jefferson Airplane years where Slick's voice is the one steady element in a performance that is otherwise drifting. She also had a wit and a self-possession that cut through interviews in ways that made journalists take her seriously at a time when female rock musicians were rarely afforded that. In later interviews, Slick described those Airplane years with the kind of matter-of-fact honesty that became her signature. She painted a picture of an entire touring world built around substance use, not just her, not just the band, but the whole ecosystem of promoters, roadies, hangers-on, and fellow musicians who moved through that circuit together. She recalled specific tours where virtually everyone involved was operating in an altered state of some kind, and where that was simply considered normal. She neither romanticized it nor condemned it. It was simply the environment, and she was inside it.
You go chasing rabbits.
Number 2. Neil Young. Neil Young's relationship with marijuana through the late 1960s and 1970s was extensive, consistent, and by his own account in later years, deeply connected to the way he heard music and approached writing it. His 1972 album Harvest, recorded partly at his ranch in Northern California, became one of the best-selling albums of that year and one of the most enduring of the decade. Young described the atmosphere around those sessions in terms that made clear sobriety was not part of the picture.
Together we may get away.
His live performances with Crazy Horse during this period carry a particular quality that is hard to describe but easy to hear. Song stretch. Notes are held beyond their natural duration. The band follows Young's guitar into long, searching passages that have no fixed destination and find one anyway. He has always valued emotional truth over technical precision, and his relationship with cannabis throughout this era appears to have deepened that tendency in ways that shaped the entire character of his 1970s output. Albums like Tonight's the Night, On the Beach, and Zuma, which remain some of the most raw and unguarded records of that decade. Young wrote about this period with characteristic directness in his 2012 memoir, Waging Heavy Peace. He discussed his use and his eventual decision to stop, not framed as a dramatic turning point or a crisis survived, but simply as a change he made at a certain point in his life. The 1970s performances that survive on film carry a warmth and searching quality that no amount of studio production could have created. Number 1. Keith Moon. Keith Moon was not simply a drummer who used substances before going on stage. He was a theatrical event unto himself, a musician whose relationship with destruction extended from the hotel rooms he demolished to the drum kits he exploded at the climax of Who concerts throughout the 1960s and 1970s. The band's shows were extraordinary on multiple levels. Pete Townshend's writing, Roger Daltrey's voice, John Entwistle's immovable bass playing, but Moon was the element that made them feel genuinely dangerous. His consumption of alcohol and prescription pills before and during performances was not a secret even within the band. Townshend and Daltrey have recounted specific incidents going back to the mid-1960s, where Moon arrived at a venue in a condition that seemed to preclude any possibility of performing, and then walked out and played with ferocious, unhinged brilliance. He had a physical relationship with the drums that was entirely his own, flailing, inventive, attacking the kit from angles that conventional technique would never suggest, somehow holding the beat together through sheer instinct while appearing to be doing the opposite. The 1973 Quadrophenia tours often cited as a period when his limitations became more visible. There were shows where he had to be helped to his kit. There were evenings when his tempos drifted in ways that made the rest of the band visibly uncomfortable. By the mid-1970s, he looked considerably older than his years, and his playing, while still capable of moments of genuine inspiration, had begun to show what his body had absorbed over the previous decade. He died in London on September 7, 1978, at the age of 32 from an accidental overdose of Heminevrin, a prescription sedative he had been given to help manage alcohol withdrawal. The medication was not to be taken in large quantities. Moon took 32 tablets and did not wake up. He had been working with The Who on what would become their final album with him. What he left behind, the recordings, the footage, the recollections of those who watched him perform night after night, is a portrait of extraordinary natural ability, meeting extraordinary excess. There was genuinely no one like him before, and there has been no one quite like him since. If you made it through this list, chances are you remember some of these names from the first time around, or you're discovering just how remarkable and reckless that era really was. The 60s and 70s produced music that still holds up, made by people who often burned incredibly bright and incredibly fast. Either way, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. There is plenty more where this came from.